Good morning or good afternoon. This is Pete Gunter again. And today we're dealing with feminism in the arts and what kind of implication that has for the art institutions that we have and the cultural structures that are in force that we are trying to cope with. And nobody is apparently very happy with whatever coping we have done. So feminism is an interesting subject. You may say, well, but it is not part of aesthetics. Feminism is one thing, aesthetics is another. I'm not sure quite that that's true uh, for reasons that would make some feminists upset, I think. But women may have insights that men have a hard time getting. And that could as easily be into colors and patterns and textures and structures, or it could be into human character and what people are like and so forth. Notoriously, men have a hard time understanding women. I think women do better at understanding men than men do understanding women. So it might be that certain aspects of femininity would broaden our conception of art. And so that it wouldn't be just a question of feminism, but of, to me, the holy grail of aesthetics and science and everything else, wholeness, trying to see all the aspects of a thing rather than just one part or another. Trust me, you can make a great career in academia from seeing just one thing and dogmatically asserting it against everything else, or in art. Now, having said that, let's go back just a minute to Plato. What did we say about Plato? That along with Tolstoy and Freud, he is considered one of the three major critics of art. All of the other people in this course that we've discussed are in favor of art or think very highly of it. But Plato has his doubts, and they are rather, and when you read his treatment of the arts in the Republic, which is the main place where he deals with the arts, you got to be very struck rather, by his critique of Greek art in his time. Now, having said that, we don't know much about Greek music. We don't have it. We don't have the scores. We can't reduplicate exactly the way the Greeks played their music or what their songs or longer compositions were. So that's a limitation. And then other aspects of Greek art, we just don't know. We don't know about their music. We don't know about their painting. We do know, for instance, something that struck me as very strange, that Greek statues were painted to look like real human beings or real whatever. The statue might have been of a horse. But we don't know how they painted them. Did they try to be just as close to what an eye or an ear or a tooth, and what colors were they? I hope they didn't paint the teeth yellow. That would have been kind of un-Greek. But we just don't know. And so some of Plato's criticism of music, we have a hard time finding, although we get a general picture that if the music is Apollinian, Plato liked it. If it's Dionysiac, he didn't like it. And indeed, when you follow Plato, as you can't, what you have is just a small section out of the Republic and Dr. Gunter talking to you about it. Sometime you might get a good translation of the Republic and read it. Find it, see if you don't find it interesting. But where Plato is critical of the arts is at 3 points. I'm covering the lecture again so that you'll have a pretty good idea of what you can get out of Plato. And the first thing is Greek religious literature. The Greek Bible consisted of Homer and a guy named Hesiod, who wrote Works and Days and Theogony, the birth of the gods. And he finds and then the second is poetry, in which you would think he would include music. And then the third is what you find really strange is his condemnation of tragedy and comedy. You won't have those in the Republic. You feature Nietzsche rolling over and over and cursing and swearing at Plato, but you could see why. But the other part of this is that what Plato does never criticize is Greek architecture or sculpture. And these are two aspects of Greek art that have had an immense influence. Look at half of the public buildings in Washington, D.C., our nation's capital. Much of that is borrowed, not all, but much of it is borrowed from Greek architecture. The columns, the entablature, other aspects of architecture. And of course, the Greeks were very shrewd, the architects were. They would not build a perfect building. They would build it so that it was just angled just enough that it looked like a perfect square or rectangle. So the Greek buildings were built off scale just slightly so that they would look perfectly in scale. I mean, these guys were, there's feminism again. Some of these may have been women architects, but we don't know it if that's true. In fact, there's a great deal we don't know about the arts, and we just have to make do on what survives and on the commentary of writers at the time. Okay, so when Plato then, in effect, seems to criticize anything that Nietzsche would have qualified as Dionysiac, granted that Nietzsche never quite told us which Dionysiac and what is Dionysus and all that kind of thing. Well, okay. He's going to take the Greek Bible and go through it and cut out all the juicy parts. And he's going to go through, like with Homer, and if the gods castrate their father or murder their children or rape their wife or God knows what horrible thing you find the gods doing, the young people in Plato's Republic are not going to be told these stories. And the question is, would they ever hear them? And my suspicion is that once somebody was 21 years old and out in the world, then they would learn about these other things. But it would no longer be a stock part of Greek culture. So, what do we think about this? There seemed to be no limit to what artists claim as their freedom. And so if you write a book, which the French poet Baudelaire did, Les Fleurs du Mal, the flowers of evil, the beautiful things that arise from evil. So if you want something beautiful, be evil. Well, a lot of people find that fun and games. In any honky-tonk I was ever at, there were some people who were Baudelairean. They just didn't know it and didn't talk like it either. The beauty of the dark side, the beauty and power of the dark side of the force is compelling to some. And this was part of the American cultural revolt of the 1960s and early 70s, when you had people taking various aspects of what was considered evil or bad and playing them up as being good, drugs among them. So after the Greek religious texts, the scriptures, then Plato goes after the poets and claims that they really don't understand. They imitate, but they don't understand what they're imitating, and the result has, let's say, no redeeming social significance. Okay? And then finally, he excludes Sophocles. And he excludes Aristophanes. Aristophanes, the writer of comedies, and Sophocles, a writer of very balanced, very sane tragedies. They're not going to be in the Republic. So when you come to our own time, so I want to make 2 points about this, or 3 really. One is, if there was an Apollinian aspect of Greek art, and that was their architecture, no criticisms at all. And then, second, how much is he going to exclude? And is he going to exclude this from his society, his ideal society, completely? There he's not as clear as you'd like him to be, but there's not going to be much artistic freedom in the Republic. And this point where Plato says that, really is trying to say that art is not good for the people, that we have too much art. He had never lived in Texas, or he never would have said that. Well, Texas and Oklahoma and Kansas have too much art. I really don't think so, that we're in any great danger from what is usually thought of as art. But he thinks it's bad for the soul. And I don't find him, and this is something that Miss Bishop, your grader, and I were talking about after the last lecture. How far did he go? And really, wasn't Plato an artist? Because he created an art form, and that's the dialogue. He was a literary genius besides being a philosophical genius, and he created an art form. Is there going to be no dialogue in Plato's Republic? Is there going to be a Socrates in Plato's Republic? And I think the general feeling is that Plato gives so much to Apollo that he's got a sort of a society which lacks, I don't know if you know the American word spizorinctum, it lacks effervescence. It's champagne without the bubbles. And well, this is my cat. This is Zigzag. I used to carry him in my hand when he was a kitten, and so he comes around looking for friendship. No, you can't have friendship. Not here. We're doing philosophy. And so, how far did Plato go, and why did he go that far? He makes a much more plausible case. And finally, to remind you, because you'll be tested on it on the next hour exam, the second hour exam, and that is, now it slipped my mind, so I'm sitting here, kindly old Professor Gunter, not remembering what he was going to say. Well, the question, I think, is how far Plato is really willing to go, and did he not sacrifice too much to the god Apollo when he should have paid some attention to Dionysus? His ideal society is what Karl Popper, a 20th century German-English philosopher, he really creates a closed society. Now, this term, incidentally, closed society versus open society, was first created by a guy named Henri Bergson, whom I have been very restrained and have not heaped upon him, though I think there's a great deal in Bergson. But Popper wrote a book called The Open Society and Its Enemies, and one of them is Plato, because nothing is going to enter into Plato's ideal society, and it's going to have to be a city sufficient to itself. Our modern notion of an open society in which there is creativity, in which there are new ideas, in which there is new art, in which there is new technology. Plato might have been able to encompass some of that, but they seem to be basically excluded. So Plato, a great philosopher with much to say, ends up being a kind of problem, I think. Plato is problematic. And I think that when I mentioned the good things in Plato, let me reiterate something before we get started on feminism, and that is that Plato, in a way, was a feminist. And why? Because he thought that women had all sorts of abilities that they were not allowed to use in Athenian society, and the ideal society which should use talent and intelligence and ability wherever it finds it. People with those abilities should be put in positions of power or of responsibility, I think would be a better word. And so Plato's Republic, his university that he created in Athens, admitted women. And people in Athens thought that was really kind of odd and a waste of time, but he did it. And his reason was, number one, you need all the ability you can get. For a period of time, Margaret Thatcher ruled 20th century England. She was a woman, and she was the best of the people in Parliament. You may not agree with her policies, and you may not like her, but you couldn't deny her ability. And Joan of Arc could lead an army. And my favorite was a woman you've probably never heard of, Boadicea, who was a Celtic chieftainess who led the Celtic armies against the Romans. She was a very good general, but the Celts were no match with their tribal warfare for the organized Roman armies. Yes, there have been many examples. Queen Elizabeth did a very good job of running England, and so did Queen Victoria, who's not my favorite person, but you can't doubt her intelligence or her ability. So why can't women be generals? And why can't women be presidents or prime ministers? And Catherine the Great of Russia isn't called the Great just because somebody's a feminist. She's Catherine the Great because she was an exceptionally good czar. Of course, she was German. She would lead you into, well, I won't get into that. We will leave the Germans aside. Germans don't have many women leaders, somehow. So where am I? You say, well, you're losing me. Where are you going, Dr. Gunter? Well, I'm going towards feminism, and I'm trying to say why Plato was a feminist for matters of the use of talent, and second, for matters of what we might call fairness or justice. Now, let's turn around, and we have an article on why are there no great women artists? And the authoress of that article says, well, there aren't. There have been many good women artists, but there have been no, that we would know, Michelangelos, for example. There have been women novelists. My favorite, that is George Sand. And you say, well, George is a man. No, she took the man's name, George. This is let's see, 18th century French novelist. So if I had that right, it could be 19th, but the point is that she took a man's name so she could publish as an artist. And so what I'm saying here, and this is a bit of a detour from simple aesthetics, about which I take the liberty of taking that detour, that most of us simply don't realize the obstacles that women face if they want to be a professional if they want to be an artist or a businesswoman or a doctor or a philosopher. When I came here to the University of North Texas during the Pleistocene, it seems like so long ago now, there were only men in the philosophy department. Now the chairman is a woman, and there are many women, and everybody gets along and philosophy gets taught. But that's one example that is right under my nose, and I find it very interesting. But a woman who wanted to be a philosopher in 1940, except as Sappho put it, for a few good men, couldn't make it in the profession. And I don't know how many of us realize that, and it's worth realizing that women face all kinds of ingrained opposition. In the business world, there's something called the glass ceiling. I don't know if you've ever heard of the glass ceiling, but it works like this. Women go into a corporation and rise, and they do very well, but they never reach the really higher echelons. There's a glass ceiling they can't break through. So men are always leading the corporation. Is that always wise for the corporation? I promise you, there are corporate vice presidents. Oh, there are many vice presidents and presidents who are not so swift. They're there because of the good old boy network. They're there because of the old school tie. They're there because they knew how to play the politics, but they're not very good at what they do. Well, we need all, if we want to compete against other nations, as now we must do. Certainly we want all the talent we can get, and some of that will be feminine. Okay? So the feminists have, I think, a very good case that they can make for this. What they don't have, what they have not been able to convince people of, is the social and societal constraints on women that most of us just aren't aware of. Let me give you 2 examples. Let's see what you think. One was my grandmother, Hortense Blanton. She was a farm girl, part Cherokee farm girl out of the hills of Tennessee. That's way low on the social ladder, promise you. And hell, she spent most of her life cooking for my grandfather's work crews. He was a construction man, and he fed his workers. And she was a good cook, and so he had a lot of good workers. But number one, when my mother or her aunt that was raised as same age, raised as her sister, Aunt Topsy, would see a dress or a jacket or a coat in the newspaper, the Dallas Morning News or the Gainesville newspaper, and they would come to her in the morning and say, "Look at this, that's a beautiful dress," or "That's a wonderful jacket that I could wear." By evening, Grandma would have made it. That is, now this, I mean, when I say they were out of the hills of Tennessee, sometime if you went to Coffee County, Tennessee and visited Blanton Chapel, I mean, it's in the hills. And I'll pass along another folk tale. Mother and father went over there to visit their relatives on a Model A in the 1920s. And they get there and they're finally convinced these people that she is one of the cousins, and so they accept her. As they're standing there, here comes this guy coming down the hill, and he's got a wagon, and everything he owns is piled in that wagon. And he comes up and stops the wagon and talks to him. And they said, "Well, why are you moving to town?" It was another second cousin or aunt or uncle, or I guess. And he said, "Well, hell, I don't want to live in a place where I have to break my leg just to get to town." So his wagon had turned over on the road, and he had broken his leg, and then had to have all surgery and all kinds of things. That's the kind of place it was. people were fleeing the country because, well, for one thing, you might have to break your leg to get to town. But this was a remote place in the hills. But one time, Mom and Grandma were at a store in Chicago called Marshall Fields, and it's a very important Chicago store, still famous. And so Mom was wearing a dress that her mother had designed and created. I mean, she just could do this at the drop of a hat. And one of the people there in the store stopped them and said, "Where did you get that dress?" And Mom said, "Well, this is my mother, and she designed it. She's good at design." And they, on the spot, they offered her a position with Marshall Fields as a dress designer because what she had done was so good. Okay, if you're Scottish and Cherokee, it just comes with the territory. So, could she do that? And she struggled with it and finally said, "Well, no, I can't do that to my family." Maybe she would have been better off to go to Chicago and be that dress designer. She'd have become wealthy, she could have supported the family. But women don't do that. And of course, this leads to some problems with feminist artists or feminist businesswomen. What becomes of the family? And it can be very hard to be both a successful businesswoman and a mother. Then I think really, if that's the situation, that probably the husband needs to step in and do some of the housework. And you'll say that's not what a real man would do. Now, I was raised on the same stuff that you are. You probably were. That, you know, a man is sort of like, I don't know what, some kind of a semi-gorilla with aggressive instincts and will fight at the drop of a hat. In Texas, we wouldn't accept you as a real person if you didn't build the log cabin you were born in. You know, it was that kind of thing. Yeah, there are lots of problems that come with it, but should Grandma have done that? But she had the ability. Now, was she born with it? I don't think there's any question. Nothing in her background up in those hills particularly set her up to be a designer. It's just innate, or you're born with it. It's genetic, if you like. Well, here's another example from my wife's family. Two families of very different backgrounds. My wife's family was from Boston, and they couldn't help it. And so her great-grandfather was a well-known American painter, Thomas Wilmer Dewing, a tonalist or semi-impressionist of the turn of the 19th into the 20th century. So popular was he that Theodore Roosevelt had him paint one of the grand pianos in the White House. I think it's still there with his painting on it. But he, if you go to the Freer Museum in D.C., I think, Freer was one of Dewing's patrons, and so you get all sorts of Dewing paintings. They strike me as a bit strange. They're mostly women in an idealized landscape with an idealized, almost transcendent beauty, and then a dark shadow following the beauty. It's interesting if you ever get a chance, and you could get on the internet and you could get some of, but his wife was named Maria Oakey Dewing. She was an artist, and we had one of her paintings that we sold to a woman's art museum in North New York, and it was worth a great deal more than we ever thought it was. And we still have one of Dewing's paintings, Mr. Dewing, his sketches in the you passed by it on the way in here. But she did many of the parts of Dewing's paintings. She was an equal as an artist to what he did. Now, she might not have painted in the same way he did. Did she have genius? Well, I think because she spent her life on her family and chose to do that rather than have a career as an artist. But those are two examples within my own family, and there got to be examples in many people's families of where somebody was a woman, could they make a career as an artist? And everything was against them. Could a woman be a philosopher? Uh, it would have been unheard of until the 20th century. One of my wife's great aunts, I'll think of her name in a minute, became a philosopher because William James, not Henry and certainly not Jesse, William James was broad-minded and he thought a woman could be a philosopher. So he let her into the Harvard philosophy program. But this was in, say, 1900. That is, at that time, there were no women philosophers. Well, you can't tell me that women don't have the talent to be a philosophy professor. Well, some won't be so talented, but then a lot of the men who teach philosophy, you might find out, aren't necessarily that talented. So I'm really just trying to introduce you to the problems of feminism in art. Now, the article that we're reading, the next article, and this is the one we're reading now, is Why Are There No Great Women Artists? And in our textbook, Aesthetics, the Big Questions, it's on pages 314 and 323. Then the next one is a similar article by a surly feminist, terrible temper, and it's on pages 300 and 305, or it precedes Why Are There No Great Women Artists, and starts on page 300. So I'm just trying to get you introduced to this with some of the questions that come with it. Now, show me, is this the cat trying to get out? Pardon us while we stop and let the cat and dog out.